Hi, my name is Jordan McGraw. I'm a graduate student at Purdue University studying graphics programming. Over the term of this semester, I worked on 3 independent games. My goal was to design, compose, and program each game myself. I began the semester by developing an infinite runner called Cataclysm. In Cataclysm, you play as a cat leaping across Titanic-sized flaming cat towers. The challenge was to create a quirky and stylistic game only using one button input. I began by designing the main character in an idle pose. After I was satisfied with the result, I formed it into an idle and running animation. To make jumping feel more responsive and emotive, I designed the character's mid-air pose to include separate rise and fall animations. In addition, these would help the input state of the character be more apparent. After all the art assets had been made, I began working on programming. I like to structure my projects programmatically as if they were plays. If an entity acts upon the world, it's considered an actor. If the utility of an entity depends on its interaction with an actor, it's defined as a prop. Both props and actors inherit from the same class. In Cataclysm, the only actor is the player. The platforms, kibble, and boxes are all the props on the stage. This categorical system is persistent throughout all of my projects, and it's my preferred way of conceptualizing the framework of the game. I allotted myself a week and a half in total for development, and upon its completion, I switched gears immediately to drafting the next project. If I were to make any improvements, I would primarily focus on adding music, sound effects, and optimizing memory usage. With the completion of each project, I spent the following weekend expanding my engine to include features I anticipated needing. I wanted my next project to include music, however I didn't feel I was ready to compose anything myself. I compromised by using a constant tempo recording of Moonlight Sonata and added additional drum layers. Instead of exporting a single audio file, I decided to save out each drum layer as a separate track and introduce them at different points throughout the game. I felt this would subtly help in developing a sense of progression. The challenge for the project was to lead the player without any explicit text or instruction. I decided to approach the challenge by taking advantage of complementary colors to draw attention to points of interest within the game. After I found a suitable color palette, I began the process of drawing the environment itself. As I was completing the exterior and interior rooms, I created the character and animated his walk cycle. I budgeted the majority of my time towards art, as the programming responsibilities were going to be fairly straightforward. To make the experience more cinematic, I introduced ambient sound effects and subtle camera movement. I made certain to avoid any sudden or inorganic movements on the camera, and I gave it a slow waving bob. In addition, I chose to weight the camera halfway between the character and the cursor, since they are both equally of high importance. As one should expect, there is always room for improvement. For this project, I'd like to have outlined objects as they were being inspected. However, considering the challenge and constraints, I'm happy with the final result of the project. My final project was a minimalist fighting game called Muta. I wanted the gameplay to be fairly simple in order to accommodate time for the animation techniques I was going to be studying. For this project, I wanted to place a heavy emphasis on weight, anticipation, and impact. To achieve this, I included wind-up frames in my animations, brief pauses after taking damage, and sharp camera displacements. In addition, I learned to incorporate motion blur to emphasize incredibly quick motions. One of the most difficult exercises I faced involved animating portions of cloth across every frame of the main character. This task required me to scrub through every frame of an animation to determine how various environmental factors interacted with the various pockets of energy influencing the shape and form of each fabric over time. However, once I considered the weight of the fabric, the velocity of the wind, and direction on shadows, the task significantly improved in clarity. In regards to color, unifying a limited color palette made the game feel more cohesive and reduced the amount of time spent creating animations. By redesigning how the engine handled time, I was able to incorporate brief anticipatory pauses after blocking or taking damage. Changing how I managed time was also important for the timing of animation events. Previous iterations of the engine used frame counts instead of delta time to time animations with assumptions the game would remain at 60 FPS. Because animations were simply representational of a character state, occasional drops in frame rate produced little to no noticeable effect. However, I wanted the timing of events to be precise for this project. Dropping frames, however temporary, might otherwise risk the failure of a player's block or attack to register. I also needed to draw reflections on the lake water. To solve this, I edited my sprite drawing class to incorporate drawing reflections across an axis. A more interesting approach would have been to render the scene to a texture and write a water shader to warp the inverted reflection. Once I felt I had developed an understanding of the theme I wanted to approach, I began composing music. I started by learning a Hiroshi scale on the guitar and developed a bassline. I wanted something steady but heavy to accommodate the calling and answering of two different voices in the higher octaves. I repeated this design in the dialogue exchanged between the player and the game's opponent. The enemy was projected to be just difficult enough to iterate the player through the set of all dialogue options and to emphasize the content of the lines. However, I still wanted to avoid combat feeling unfair. To simplify the mechanics of the game, each attack does the same flat amount of damage, but they vary across the dimensions of knockback, range, and wind-up time. Without a visible element to indicate when an attack was ready, I decided to put all attack actions on a global cooldown. This would mean that after you've performed a combat action, you wouldn't be able to perform another one for a brief duration, blocking included. This would add fairly consistent moments of vulnerability to get into the rhythm of anticipating and avoiding. As I was working on creating music and dialogue, I began forming the silhouettes of the most important animations. Because animations take up such a large portion of the game's budget, I needed to focus on a small set of specific animation states. If I were to begin making improvements to the game, I'd start by adding functionality to skip the intro animations and jump through the dialogue. While I'm happy with how the intro turned out, it's evident you don't need to see the dialogue every time you try again. Even though I'd consider the dialogue one of the more important thematic elements, I wouldn't want to force the player to view it if they didn't wish to, particularly if I anticipated the player having to replay it multiple times. Overall, I felt the project remained cohesive and concise. I feel I was able to explore the narratives and creative depths across various mediums, which is a goal I believe to be worthwhile. Throughout the duration of the semester, I found I was much more willing to compromise with myself when I acknowledged there would be another opportunity to address my mistakes in the next project. I also spent time considering that while the executing features you've developed will eventually lose its novelty, it's important to respect and value your own work. During times like these, it's important to remember that your continued satisfaction playing the game is a fairly poor metric of progress. However, becoming overly content with the state of your work is nearly as corrosive as indulging in excessive creative tangents. It's as if the most important task in maintaining the scope of a project involves finding a place to park your car without also turning off the engine. Meanwhile, it's also best to execute small and synchronous plans that avoid needless exhaustion from treading water. Thanks for listening. Take care.